Do what? Oh, one. Felt the power just then. All right, good evening. We are in lesson 6 in our lesson books. We're slowly we've come to a crawl here in the biblical narrative. We've been hopping from scene to scene, but these past pretty much this whole book just takes place in this final week of Jesus' life. So we're getting a very zoomed in picture of some of the things that happened that week. I never really realized. We'll talk about. We won't really talk about that in class today. But as I was preparing for the class, I started doing some deep diving. I never realized there was a lot more. I wouldn't say controversy, but a lot more opinions just about when the chronology of when everything happened. I just assume, we have Good Friday and we have Easter, and that's just how it's always been, but there's not exactly consensus to when the crucifixion and when the Lord's Supper and all these things took place. So I'm not going to do that because I'm still kind of wrapping my mind around it, but that's kind of a fun little study for you to look at some of those different opinions. It doesn't really matter either way, I don't think. Only the important day would be Sunday, that the fact that he rose on the Lord's Day after 3 days. So that's where everyone does agree. But when the death occurred and when the Lord's Supper and the Passover meal and all that, was it Wednesday or Thursday or Friday? There's some debate to that. So I'll let y'all do that study on your own. I didn't want to get into that. It's also tough because the Jews they start their days in the evening, so you got to figure out, okay, is that the 14th in the morning or 14th in the evening? Which day are we talking about here? So that at some point you just kind of get tired of that and have to just take a break. So it's kind of like when we do daylight savings time, and now I got to figure out, okay, are we starting on 9 o'clock old time, 9 o'clock new time? Fortunately, we got our phones to do that for us. So let's start in Matthew chapter. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 26. This first statement, when Jesus had finished all these sayings. So what has Jesus just finished? And don't say all these sayings.
He had a couple of parables in chapter 25, and then the final judgment scene is the last thing in chapter 25.
We talked, chapter 24, 25, kind of a long section about the destruction of Jerusalem, end of times, all those things. It's a lot of parables here. So we could be talking about the finish of that discourse. Maybe that occurred at this exact day, or really this is the final of Jesus' teachings, at least that Matthew covers. So he could be talking about he's done in the book of Matthew. He's done with Jesus' teachings at this point. After we finished that portion of the book, and now we're moving on to the final events. Either way, it's a transitory statement. We're moving on to this next section, and he says, verse 2, that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Now, Jesus has talked about before, that he's mentioned being crucified. He's mentioned that he would be leaving, but this is probably the most specific, at least in terms of time, that we've seen yet.
I was just going to say, I think he pointed out in the book, talking about when he makes his transitionary statement, that this will be the final public teaching that he did. So that may be...
That could have, yeah. We'll see a lot more teachings, at least in the book of John. There'll be a lot more. So I don't think that he's just like, I'm done, let's just get to the crucifixion. I'm sure he taught more, but I think that's talking about, this is just specifically in Matthew's book. But yes, we're going to see just in the Last Supper and that whole scene, we're going to talk about the foot washing and everything. There's a lot for Jesus to cover with the disciples, but that could have been it as well. But looking forward 2 days, we're still 2 days from the Passover, and I mean, this is as specific as it gets. There's no getting around this statement. The Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. He's going to die, and it's going to come within 2 days. So imagine, that I kind of assumed that before the disciples were like, he says he's going to die. Maybe they didn't quite really believe that. But this is pretty specific. I'm going to die in 2 days. I wonder what they were thinking when he delivered this message. Then it talks about the chief priests, the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. What is Jerusalem like during the Passover time? Crowded, yeah. I mean, this is this is the big one. This is the big feast. There was other feasts that a lot of people would come to, but Passover was the biggest one. So imagine whatever Jerusalem's normal population and double that probably at this point, maybe triple it. So we're talking about thousands, hundreds of thousands of people there. So usually kind of a dicey time politically when you get all that. Think of it like the 4th of July, that nationalistic fervor going on. Very easy for things to spiral out of control quickly during this. So it's interesting. The chief priests and elders did not want to kill Jesus at this time. And what ends up happening? They did. So kind of who's in control of this situation, right? Exactly. So, the chief priests, they weren't just trying to kill him. Okay, I see him, bam, I shot him, and he's dead. They weren't just trying to kill him. They were trying to get rid of him, but they wanted to do it in a way that didn't cause a riot. And at the time that they chose, well, they end up getting their way in a sense, but not at the time that they chose. So I thought that was kind of interesting. They don't want to cause a riot, an uproar among the people. Then in Matthew, we're gonna jump. We've actually covered in the Matthew text. We've covered the anointing of the washing of Jesus' feet at Bethany. So we kind of jump ahead to a little bit in Matthew to verse 14. And I put these up there they're kind of parallel verses. In the Matthew one, then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. So that's an interesting number that Luke does not show. Luke names him. It says, "And Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was one of the 12 as well. And he went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers." In both of those, who's going where? Or who's going to who?
Judas.
Yeah, Judas is kind of, this isn't just, he was walking along, bumped into the chief priests, and they said, "Hey, you're one of Jesus' people. What will you get?" It wasn't like that. This was Judas seeking out. And of course, we see what was behind Judas doing that.
I wanted to point out that the value of that 30 pieces of silver. Did you find that out?
Yes.
Go ahead. Matthew was written to the Jews, so the Jews would know.
The 30, yeah, that's an interesting one as well. The 30 pieces is in Matthew. It doesn't mention that in Luke. The 30 pieces of silver I saw was the equivalent of about 4 months' wages, somewhere in the range of about $7,500 was what I saw. More specifically, the one that the Israelites would have caught on, it talks about in the law of Moses. That's the price for if a slave is killed if your ox gets loose and that ox gores a slave. Well, that's the price of the slave, basically. So, $7,500 is not pennies, but it's not a very big amount, is it? It's the price of a slave.
We're talking about the Savior.
Yeah, this isn't life-changing money. This isn't like they offered Judas $20 million or something and he can live in the lap of luxury forever. Like, this is okay, he can take a trip to Cyprus or whatever, and have a great time, and then he's back to where he was before. It's interesting to see. We don't know much more about Judas' mindset and motivations. We mentioned we see in other passages he's clearly a little focused on money. He's greedy, but he was one of the 12, and he clearly, we'll see as we continue through this text, when Jesus is talking about someone that's going to betray me, his name wasn't the first one to come up. They're looking around like, who's going to betray you? Like, we know we've been around each other for 3 years now. You would think that Judas would have, like, oh, of course it's Judas. Yeah, like, for what we don't know, but Judas clearly seemed like he was just as into it, and just as he went out and he was healing people, I would assume, just like all the other disciples. He was preaching, he was talking. I mean, he was no different from the others. So it's interesting. Just I guess in my mind, I've always seen Judas as this mustachioed figure, and you can point him out. He's the villain, and I don't think that's really what it was like. I think he was just a normal guy, and he slowly gave in to greed and allowed Satan to enter him in that way. And maybe at this point, maybe this was a pretty quick turnaround, but for whatever reason, he said, you know what, I'm not in this. Let me go to the chief priests and see if I can betray him and get some money out of them, and not even a big amount. It's just anyway. From this moment on, he sought an opportunity to betray him, and in Luke, he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him in the absence of a crowd. There, verse 6 of the Luke passage. So clearly, he talked with those chief priests and all those guys, and they were of the same mind. We don't want to cause an uproar. Remember, they don't want to stir up trouble. Let's see if we can catch him somewhere where he's away from the crowds. I mean, he's been in the temple. Jesus said, "I've been in the temple with you like all week, and you didn't grab me then. What's up with that?" So
The people were there listening.
the people were there. Yeah, that's exactly why they didn't want to. You're not going to arrest him and have all these people saying, "Hey, what do you do?" Or they don't want to be seen arresting him. If they did that in secret and sorry, he's dead, then what do you do? Are the people going to suddenly start to come together and then go march on the high priest's door? No, in the moment they might, but they're not gonna do that if they're just, I heard Jesus got killed. Well, I guess he wasn't the Messiah after all. So that's why they're wanting to do that in secret, away from everything. Any questions so far on those? We're going to transition over to the Luke passage here in 22, so we're getting out of Matthew just for the moment. Switch over to Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 7. Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed, and talks about some of these preparations that they were going to make. Kind of interesting. Jesus sends Peter and John and gives them this mission to go and find a room for them. I love when it's little specifics like this. He said, "Behold, you have entered the city. A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into his house." Just all these little tiny details that clearly show. It's not just, hey, go into the city and look around and find a man. Very vague instructions. These are very specific, and it's interesting. He tells them to say, "The teacher says to you, where's the guest room, that I may eat it?" So he doesn't tell him Jesus of Nazareth, just the teacher. So I wonder if that man is a disciple of some kind, or at least maybe a mild follower of Christ, of Jesus. And
these little factors were told with a purpose.
Mm-hmm. What purpose?
Your teachers tell
I'm not the teacher.
Oh, okay, you're right. To verify
Yeah.
what they should have known all along, but in these last few days, he's got so many predictions of the near future.
There's a lot of predictions going on during these. In 2 days, the Son of Man will be crucified. When you go into the city, bam, 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 all these specifics going through. So, if they didn't believe before, then I don't know how much Jesus was telling them about smaller future events, but they were getting a lot of those right now. I want to talk about the unleavened bread and the Passover, kind of talk about the difference between the two. You typically know what Passover is. A lot of times these two are kind of used interchangeably just because they happen about the same time. So you'll see them in the text used for this same feast, but they are different. Both are mentioned in Exodus chapter 12, and they take place one day after the other. So 14th day of the month of Nisan, that's when the male lamb would have been, they would get a male lamb without blemish, and at twilight, that is when the lamb would be killed. Of course, this commemorates the night when the angel of death passed over them.
Did you find out when the 14th day of Nisan is in our calendar? It's been years since it seemed like it was the middle of April.
Well, it's
I don't know for sure.
that's what's tricky with all of the dates. You have the factor of they have a different calendar than we do. So they didn't have a 365-day Julian calendar like we follow. They were following a lunar calendar. So you have that. It's just like when you're trying to line up two languages, and there's some words just don't quite equate each other. So calendars for the Jews and the calendar that we use are a little tricky. Then you have the added factor of they count time not from 12 midnight to 12 midnight, but from sunset to sunset. So so when we're thinking of Wednesday, the Wednesday the 12th of Nisan. Well, is that Wednesday night or is that during the day part? So that's one of those I didn't want to get into in this class. It's just too much to it was wrinkling my brain just to think about it. So that is an interesting study. But the 14th day of Nisan is specific to the text of Exodus. And it says the 15th day of Nisan. So if you go figure out what that day is in our calendar, then go for it. But the unleavened bread was kind of the start of this week-long event, a memorial, and that was to kind of remember just how quickly they had to leave Egypt. If you remember, at the night after all the firstborn were killed, and Pharaoh comes to Moses and says, "Get out." And he had already told them to make all this unleavened bread. They prepared that ahead of time, and they were to dress ready to go for the Passover. And then because once that final plague came, they were sent out. And from that point, then they were traveling, and then you have the Red Sea and on into the wilderness. So these take place at the same time, but a lot of times you'll see those names kind of interchange. So that's what makes it tough to when you see the verse, "Then came the day of unleavened bread." Well, which day? We got 7 days of the feast, or we're talking about when the unleavened bread was made. Well, that came before the Passover, or is it the official start of the unleavened bread feast? So that's where we got a lot of issues and tricky things with the timing of everything. One thing I just kind of assume there's too many parallels with Christ and the Passover lamb. I mean, we see that we see Christ called the Passover lamb by Paul in later texts. So I would assume that when Christ died, when he was crucified and his death, which remember the lamb was killed at twilight, I would assume that would have had to have happened about at the same time, just because, I mean, you'd hate to have so many parallels and then it was off by a day or something. So
One of the things I read that they normally prepared the lambs anywhere from 2 to 4 in the afternoon.
mhm.
And if you think about when Jesus was on the cross and he finally passed away or gave up his ghost, and that's about that same time.
And remember, with the way that the Jews kept time, that day that you killed the Passover lamb at twilight, remember they started the day at twilight, at sundown. So if you kill the lamb before sundown, then go backwards to the night before when he's celebrating the Passover. It's still the same day. If he's celebrating the Passover and the Lord's Supper and all that, the evening, then that same day is still, say it's 8 p.m. or whatever. It's still that same day, the 14th of Nisan, all the way until sunset on the next day. So we know that Lord's Supper occurred in the evening, and then all the stuff happens with Gethsemane and everything overnight, the trial and everything, and then he's killed by the next day. So he technically still celebrated the Passover on the same day, just not at the end of the day, the last few hours, but at the very beginning of those hours. And I don't want to get into, because we're not actually going to cover the Lord's Supper in this lesson. That's the next lesson. But typically when you would eat part of that lamb in the Passover meal, which it didn't seem like the disciples did, but you also think about it, there was a Passover lamb at that meal, right? Just he was still alive and kicking. So there's just too many parallels and too many things for me to think that he wasn't at least killed on the 14th day of Nisan. Now, was that on Thursday or Friday or whatever? That's up to smarter people to decide. And throughout all this, they're celebrating the Passover, and what are they doing? These guys are talking about who is the greatest. Dispute arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. And he said, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those in authority over them are called benefactors. But not so with you. Rather, let the greatest among you become as the youngest, and the leader as one who serves. For who is greater, one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves. It's interesting, this discussion and what was going on, especially in a moment when we start to talk about Jesus washing the disciples' feet. That's where they're at. They're worried about who's the greatest. And remember, he just told them, in 2 days I'm going to be crucified. So you think that'd be a little bit of a mood downer, but hey, they're worried about who the greatest is, and then in a minute Jesus is going to be washing their feet. So kind of an interesting lesson here in just a moment. So actually, yeah, go ahead and turn to John. We'll get to that. We'll get to that one here. This is where I wanted to spend some time. Any questions? Oh,
Still considering an earthly kingdom.
oh yeah,
They still haven't gotten it.
yeah. Yeah, they still haven't got it. I mean, even when he tells them, I'm going to die in 2 days, that doesn't jive with their picture of the Messiah and all that. So
And you may have been thinking that one of them was going to take over. You just never know.
I thought about that. Yeah. Okay. If he's dead, then who's going to lead this? And, who's going to be the next in line? So who's the greatest? Well, they're clearly the leader of the next, the next in line when Jesus is dead. Okay. Well, who's going to?
That's what you mean when Jesus washes their feet to show that we're all.
Mm-hmm. So that adds to this whole text here. So now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. This intro to this whole section is just powerful. Just he loved his own. He loved them to the end. He knows. We're getting to the end. You can tell this is obviously the beginning of the last chapter right here, just that kind of introduction right there. And of course it talks about during the supper when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot. Think about those two verses next to each other. He loved his own who were in the world. He loved them to the end. But Judas has already. I mean, I think Judas is still in that category. I mean, Jesus loves him.
Hopes the best.
He loved his own, yeah,
He hopes the best for them.
and he loves them to the end.
I have a footnote for that, to the end, it means to the uttermost, possibly.
Well, it could mean a bunch of things. It means as to the end of as much as he could love, or to the end of his life, or to the end of their lives. I mean, there's so many. I think it could mean all of those things. Yeah, that's one of those just kind of delicious terms that you can get lots of meaning out of, and it could mean, like I said, all those things. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he'd come from God and was going back to God, all these things, that's what's happening. He's loved them. Loves them to the end. He knows that we're getting to the end. All things have been fulfilled. And what does he do? He rose up from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, he tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. When washing feet, I mean, we think that's weird, but washing feet was not uncommon at all. When did that normally take place?
The person entered,
Yeah.
servants would clean their feet.
Yeah, that was common. You enter a house, the servants would come. Your feet are nasty. You're wearing sandals. It's a sandy area, so those feet get gross. So as soon as you enter, that's when typically someone would wash your feet. Typically servants. So they've made it through. Made it through a meal. They've made it through all this time. No one's feet have been washed. Now, we could give them an excuse and say, hey, there's no servants there. There's no, they're renting out a place or whatever. So they're not in specific one's home. So it's not not necessarily anyone's responsibility, but it's kind of interesting. No one's washed anyone's feet. I mean, I don't know if this would occur or not, but I mean, you think, okay, here, I'll wash your feet, you wash mine, or something. You could make a deal like that, just so everyone's feet is washed, just because that's what you do, so you're not dragging your dirty feet. Remember, when they sat, they weren't sitting on chairs around a table. They were reclining at the table. They were laying back, so their feet, they were, much lower to the ground, and everyone's feet was around. If your feet are under a table and there's a tablecloth or something, you don't see people's feet. When you're lying around like they are, you see their feet. So they're trying to eat and got them stinky feet sitting up there. You'd think someone would say, hey, let's go around and wash each other's feet but what would that do? If you're washing someone's feet, what does that make you?
Make your hands dirty,
Make your hands dirty.
make you a servant.
Make you the servant, yeah. And what are they arguing about a minute ago? Yeah, so if they're worried about that, they're not going to take the chance of doing something kind like that and think, oh, then he's clearly not the next in line for the head of the the head of the way. Once Jesus is gone. Yes, Howard.
I was just gonna say it's another one of those statements here that we tend to sort of just brush by it, but it said that, that he had come from the Father and was going back to God.
Mhm.
Come from God and going back to God. From all eternity, he's been in heaven with the Father.
Mm-hmm.
And then he came and lived his life here and did all this. And now he knows he's going back to be received by the Father again. So this has got to be, for him at least, and we should see it too, a great moment for
Yeah.
him. He knows now that it's time.
I saw one parallel in verse when it talks about verse 4, where he rose from supper and laid aside his outer garments. This is kind of a small statement of his entire story. He rose from his place in heaven and laid aside those heavenly garments, right, and came to this world, lowered himself. And what did he do while he was here? He was cleansing people. He was washing people's hearts, in a sense, right? So I thought that was an interesting statement. Poured water and wrapped it with the towel that was wrapped around him. It's interesting. He got around. I don't know how many he got around to before Simon, but clearly they just let it happen. And then I kind of wonder. Peter gets a bad rap, so I hate to pick on him, but I get the sense, he sees everyone allowing this to happen, and he sees this as an opportunity to make himself the greatest by saying, "Oh no, I'm," it's that false humility, right? I don't do that to me. You're too great for me. These other guys, they didn't say that, but I'm telling you how great you are. You shouldn't be washing my feet. So I don't know if that was his mindset or not, or if he was just weirded out or what. But with the whole who's the greatest and who's not the greatest, that would kind of fit with the moment here. And Jesus told him, he said, "What I am doing, you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." What does he mean? When will they understand?
After his death.
Probably after what's coming of within just a day, and his resurrection as well. But Peter said, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." So again, Peter. Two wrongs don't make a right. he goes to the other extreme. He says, "All right, wash my hands, wash my head, wash my not just my feet. Give me the full washing here." And Jesus said, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." So what does that tell us? Whose feet has he washed? I mean, imagine that. I mean, Judas clearly, I think that tells us more about Judas' mindset here. This wasn't just this was strong feelings of Judas that he clearly has completely departed from what's going on here. He is even, you would think at this, like, "Oh, Jesus, how could I betray Jesus? He's washing my feet right now." But he's still, he's gone. His whole heart has completely left Jesus.
I grew up in a church where we practiced washing feet.
So yeah, there are still churches that do that.
And it's funny because my dad would always make sure his feet was smelling good.
We taught it at our school that we taught at back in Florida. Our principal was that was one thing he would do, is he would get up and he'd get one or two of the students and he'd wash their feet, and just as kind of an object lesson, not as I think he didn't think that this was something we had to do, or this was an ordinance or something that we were told to, but he used the same object lesson for the students, just as Jesus was doing here. And then they kind of get a little bit of the understanding what was happening here right away. When he had washed their feet, put on his outer garments, and resumed his place, he says, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I, then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should also do as I have done to you." So again, we talked about, no one's feet have been washed at this point. And that seems to be maybe a failing on the part of the apostles for not doing that just to each other. You didn't
Just at that physical level either.
Yeah. So he tells them, "Hey, if I, your Lord and teacher, if I am willing to have washed everyone's feet, not just one, but everyone's." I mean, that was probably a pretty long process. That might have taken, 15, 20 minutes or something. And they're all just Was it silent the whole time as they were watching? Were they murmuring to each other? Was Jesus saying anything? I don't know. Just an interesting sequence, but the example is obviously if I can do this, if I can humble myself, if I can be a servant, then you should be a servant just as I have. Truly, truly, verse 16, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Twice there, greater is used. So, you get the sense Jesus heard their conversation and he's using those exact same words that they were using, but teaching them what they really should have been talking about. A servant is not greater than his master. Who's the greatest? Who's going to be the greatest of our group? Well, a servant's not greater than his master. So, if you want to be first, you have to be last. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I'm not speaking of all you. I know whom I've chosen, but the scripture will be fulfilled. He who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. I'm telling you this now before it takes place, that when it does take place, you may believe that I am he. So he's telling them all these, not just this, but remember when they were preparing for the Passover, he told them exactly how they would find a place to do that. And he told them that in 2 days I'm going to be crucified. And I'm telling you that so when they happen, you will believe that I am he. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever receives the one I send receives me, and whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. Going back to verse 18, he's talking about, the scripture, he who ate my bread has lifted his heels against me. Obviously talking about Judas there. How many times, just in all these, I also get this, we talked about how Jesus loved them to the end. And, he knows what the scripture says, so he knows what's going to happen. And yet I feel like he's still trying to, hey, Judas, I know what you're doing. I know what you're thinking. How many clues has Judas gotten at this point that Jesus knows what's going on? If anyone thinks that Judas just did this on accident and didn't have any, Jesus just let him go. Look at so many examples of Jesus trying to bring him back and not let that happen, but he knows what's gonna happen.
And then he finally gives up on it. Just go.
he says go, do what you're doing. Verse 21, after saying these things, Jesus was troubled in his spirit. Why is he troubled in his spirit? What's he thinking about?
Betrayer.
Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. How many? There's so much. This is Jesus. He takes a pause just for a moment to wash some feet and address that issue. But I get the sense, even more so than the fact that he's going to die within 24 hours in a horrible fashion, he's troubled about Judas. He's troubled that he's going to be betrayed by someone that he loves, one of his own. The disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. So again, it's not like Judas was always that kind of sneaky one, or always that one they kind of suspected. He was the outcast, so it makes sense that he wasn't. We don't know much about him. It's kind of assumed that he wasn't a Galilean like most of the other disciples, but clearly, he was with them. He was their friend. They had been through so much together. This was a shock to when they figure out who it was later on. This was a shock to them. They had no idea. They didn't even have a suspicion. Verse 23, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved, who is that? That's probably John, the writer of the book. He never names himself. He always says, this is, I think, the first time he says this, but he always calls himself the one whom Jesus loved. Was reclining at table at Jesus' side, so Simon Peter motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. So that disciple, you get the picture of how this layout was set. John was next to him, and they're leaning and kind of just leaning up, using each other as like a backrest or something. That disciple leaning back said, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I will give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." So when he dipped the morsel, he gave it to Judas, the son of Iscariot. Then after he had taken the morsel, Satan entered him. Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do, do quickly." So kind of interesting. You know, Satan obviously has a role to play here, but I get the sense that there was still hope. I guess that's what Jesus was troubled about, and he's kind of dropping these clues to Judas. But at some point, there's no more that can be done. I think of Pharaoh in all of those plagues. I mean, at some point, I mean, all those warnings, all those signs. At some point, I mean, there's nothing more that can be done. I mean, he's gone. He's never coming back to. There's no chance of him repenting and turning back. So at this point, Jesus says, "What you're doing, do quickly." And again, even at this point, I don't know how many heard these statements or why they didn't clue in, but Judas, in charge of the money bag, and they still didn't suspect him at all, even at this point. They just thought he was doing something with the money, giving it to the poor or something. So the disciples still didn't suspect him there. And when he had gone out, then he does these statements. "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. Little children, yet a little while, a very little while, I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come." And think back to the beginning of chapter 13 when John, the writer, is talking about, Jesus loved them and he loved them to the end. Well, now he's giving them this command. "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another." And he's already given them an object lesson of this way that we love by being a servant, washing each other's feet, humbling ourselves for others. "And by this, people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Lastly, before we finish up, I wanted to look at this. Jesus was troubled in his spirit about what was going to happen with Judas, and you get the sense in the Luke passage, "Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail." So you almost get the sense like it could have gone, maybe, I mean, not to say that Simon Peter could have been the one that betrayed him, but Satan's he wasn't just going after Judas, he's going after all of them. And Judas, and really they're all going to fall in one way or the other. They're going to desert him. And Simon, more specifically, is going to be knocked down a peg. Of course, who was probably if you had to guess who was the greatest among them, you would have said Simon. Just by later on in Acts, we see him in a leadership role. He was clearly very connected with Jesus. So if the 12 were sitting around and guessing who probably is the greatest, they would probably say Simon. And it's interesting that Simon's going to be or Peter's going to be the one that has the greatest fall outside of Judas. The others just left. Simon obviously is going to deny him those 3 times. But Jesus prayed that his faith may not fail. Does it fail? Slips. Yeah, that's a good word. That's a good way to say it. It slips. But, just studying all of Peter's statements, he's bold and just, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death." And, "Oh, you're that ready? You think you're such hot stuff? You're going to deny me 3 times that you know me." Or in the John passage, verse 37, "Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." You get the sense actually just these two conversations are not exactly parallel. He finishes. Jesus says that the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. But I get the sense that he tells Peter this more than once. So just like he was giving those clues to Judas, he's given these clues to Simon and warning him about what's to come.
It's interesting in that Luke's recount of it, he says, when you have turned again, strengthen your brother.
Mm-hmm.
He knows that he's going to fall. He's praying for him. But he also knows that he's going to turn back.
Yep. So he knows who the betrayer is. He knows that they will fall, but he also knows that they will make it through, and their faith will not fail. All right, thank you.
You need 2 stooges and a dumpling.
If only everybody would do that for me when I get up to talk. Okay? Everywhere that I go, just have him with me, and everybody goes, shh, shh. That way he can speak. I was thinking about what I would give for the invitation tonight. There's a couple of different options for me, I thought, at least, as I was thinking about it. One would be the hour that we've lost this past weekend. And the older I get, the more I feel the hour that I lost. It's funny how that works. But ever since we lost it, I felt like I have just been behind. And not schedule-wise, I've kept up with that, but energy-wise, I just hadn't caught up. Of course, it didn't help that I also had to go into work early one morning, too. So between the two, I just feel blah. And so I thought about, I told Keith, it's been quite a few years now, but I did a lesson one year right after we lost our hour, the difference an hour makes. And it does make a difference. An hour makes a difference in your life at times, according to what happens in that hour. But I decided against that one, and decided against something that we talked about this evening in our auditorium class. Brother Allen led us in our study this evening, and we're studying the life of Christ, and specifically the last week of the life of Christ. And we were focused in a lot this evening on Jesus and his teaching with the disciples and some of his last moments with his disciples, all of the disciples, including Judas. And how that many of the things that Jesus said during that last week or so, even before then, would have been something that you would have thought would have pricked the heart of Judas. That it would have been something that would have caused him pause in some of the plans that he was making, obviously privately. He had not made his plans known that he wanted to betray Jesus. He had not made it known to anyone, except obviously he had been mulling it over in his own mind, a way in which he could make money. And yet it did not appear to the others around him that there was anything wrong, anything going on. They wondered who it could be when he said at the Passover table with them that one of you will betray me. Well, who is it? Lord, is it I? Is it I? You know, they were wondering. And yet you know that in his mind, Judas knew that he was actually the one that had been thinking about it. And when you think about that for just a few moments, you think, again, human nature is all the same. Judas is no different than we are. We have things that go on in our minds that we don't tell everybody. We have things that we think about. We have problems in our lives that we don't share with everyone else. I think that was what happened to him. He had a problem in his life that he didn't share with anyone else, and it caused him deep grief and problems, and in the end, it cost him his life and soul. Because after he had delivered up Jesus, after they had tried him and convicted him, although he had committed no crime. Matthew 27 says in verse 3, then when Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. Don't you think that if he could have seen the end, he would have never done it? And yet while we're in the midst of doing things that we know better than to do, we don't take the right viewpoint. We don't look at the end. I remember many years ago, Brother Billy Fly told me a couple of different things about debates that he had, those friendly debates that he would have. And he said that he talked to a man one time. He says, do you think that you could be blinded by greed with just $1? And the guy said, no, not for $1. And he took out a dollar bill and he put it right in front of his eyes. He said, there you are, you're blinded. We can be blinded by our own weaknesses and faults and think that it's not that bad. And then when we get down too far down the road, we look back and think, man, if I would have just known. If you're here this evening and there's something in your life that's not right and something that you need help with, we want to help you. We all need help. All of us. In every area of life, we need help. That's why one of the reasons why God gave us brothers and sisters in Christ is to help each other. So if we can help you in making your life right with God and becoming a Christian, if that be your need this evening, we'd love to help you. Won't you come while we stand and while we sing?
He appears,
and the light from heaven shines. I'll forget every fear, every pain I'll leave behind. Then I'll see
I'm just surprised Brother Billy admitted he had $1. He was a wonderful man. He set a lot of good examples and a lot of good things in his life for all of us. But he would pick at everybody, and so we picked at him back. So he's one that we'd miss. It's good to see everybody else tonight. I'll run through this as quickly as possible. I still want to give time to them, so everybody will still know. Shelby's still home, sick, double ear infection. She knows it's got to be painful. Melissa's home with a headache tonight. She's not feeling well. I want to continue to remember Lisa Hegler. Her surgery for her spot on her head is the 23rd. Be sure to remember that because that is a cancer, and hopefully that's the last one they'll find on her. Yeah, she rolled her eyes. But let's see, Isaac Kennedy, he's homesick tonight. Whatever his roommate had, he got it from him. Remember Sister Helen Cooley, still having severe back pain, and it doesn't seem to be getting really any relief for that. Jake and Misha are home tonight with Millie, who has a fever. Good to see Miss Mabel back. I'm glad y'all are feeling better. It's bad when the little ones get sick. You feel kind of helpless, but that's good to see him back. On the traveling list, the Brian Woods and his family, excuse me, are in Mexico for spring break. Lance Epperson and his family are in the mountains, and then the Smith family are also traveling in the mountains. And Miss Brenda Harville is supposed to be on her way back today or tonight, so hopefully she'll be with us on Sunday morning. She said she was ready to get back, and we said we were glad to see her smiling face when she gets there, because she's always got a smile on her face. That's always. We have a couple of young men visiting with us tonight from Cookville. They came straight in from Cookville to see us all. Jeb and Cameron, we want good to see you guys. Meetings in the area, Chickasaw Drive, March 21st, 24th at 7 p.m. Had the name, but I guess I didn't make it out. But anyway, elders and deacons meeting will be Sunday at 3:30 here in the building. I probably left somebody out, but if I do, I apologize. Just get with me. We've got a mess here. But if you wish to be standing, we'll do so, and Brother Sean Hampton will dismiss in our closing prayer.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the wonderful many blessings you have given us. Thank you for this wonderful evening that we've been able to come here and hear your word, study it, and sing songs and praises in your name. Thank you for this wonderful country that we live in, that we are able to do this freely. Please be with the women and the families of those who fight to keep that so. Please be with all those who are sick. May they get to feeling better, and people who are traveling, may they reach their destination safely. We know all things are done in your will and not ours. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay.